Hello and welcome to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law. We're now into the third week of the US and Israel's war of choice against Iran. And my guest today is Sanam Vakil. Sanam is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at London's Chatham House. Sanam, very good to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you for having me back, Bill.
You know, Sanam, something I do to keep myself sane is to flip on its head pretty much everything Donald Trump says. So, for example, in a recent Truth Social screed, he called Ukraine's President Zelensky P.T. Barnum. Okay, I flipped that, and the true circus salesman is Donald Trump. The president says the U.S. is winning the war, hands down. I flipped that over. So, should I be thinking it is Iran that is winning the war right now, Sanam? Even though the Israelis have just said they've killed two more key regime figures?
Well, I don't know if this makes me sane to think about things in converse ways, but I think it's rather smart, Bill, for you to do so. Let me put it this way. I don't think that Iran is winning in a conventional sense. Iran's strategy is predicated on survival, and it cannot win this war from a military perspective. It is taking blows, very heavy blows, day to day from the United States, the most formidable power militarily, as well as Israel, the region's military power. But for Iran, if it does survive, and if the Islamic Republic, regenerates itself, that will be a win on its own, oftentimes in the Middle East. And we've seen this in the history books. Not losing to a superior, if not superpower, is a victory. So that's what they're trying to achieve. But what matters is not just survival, but how Iran and how specifically the Islamic Republic survives. It needs a deal that guarantees its survival, that prevents another war from resurfacing in 6 months or 6 years from now. And ultimately, it needs sanctions relief. And it's in this moment very hard to see how those objectives can be achieved, especially from a US president who might be a circus salesman, but he's definitely not a trustworthy one.
Yeah. And this tactic, the Israelis are saying again, we're cutting off the tentacles of the octopus. That's the phrase they're using now. Can that tactic work, or is the structure still strong enough to withstand that and again more and more assassinations of top people?
Well, we're 2.5 weeks into this war. For me, it certainly feels much longer. We have to see how effective the Israelis will be in their targeting campaign. Certainly today, Ali Larijani and the head of the Basij, Soleimani, were also killed. I think that there still is a pretty deep command and control structure underneath these individuals that we know of. What we don't know is who is beneath them. So we're going to start to see unknown, untested figures emerge from within these systems. And, you know, what comes up with them, we will have to see. But I think for the time being, the system looks unified in fighting for its survival. I think their personal as well as regime motivating interests in working together. If there's going to be fragmentation, I could imagine that's only going to come on the day after this war, not while it's still underway.
And there's this comparison that's coming up more and more frequently with Vietnam, where you had this massive superiority in terms of military strength set up against this people who were determined that they would not let the imperialist power defeat them. Is that a fair comparison?
I mean, I think that is a fair analogy. What the Islamic Republic is trying to do as the weaker party with only asymmetrical capabilities is to drag the United States into a war of attrition, similar to what the Vietnamese did back during the Vietnam War. And by spreading the costs of this war horizontally, and using Iran's drone capabilities to outlast and wear down the stronger adversary. I think the leadership hopes to showcase their survival, their determination, and out of that, bring more parties into this war, maybe not in a direct military sense, but spread the cost so widely that if and when this war comes to an end, there is much more of an international investment in making sure such a war doesn't reemerge.
Mm. Now, much of the criticism being leveled at the Trump administration is that it went to war without a strategy. That's a fair criticism. And I'm just looking at my phone now, Sanam, and Joe Kent, who is the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, has just quit. He was a big Trump fan. He's left because he says Israel called the shots on this war. Israel gulled Donald Trump into the war. He didn't say gulled, but the sense is that Trump got lured in by Israel. Is that a fair comment? Again, that it was Netanyahu who pulled Trump into this war, and there he is expanding. The Israelis are moving into Lebanon in a major way. Um, what do you think Netanyahu's end game is? Because he's got a strategy if Donald Trump does not.
Well, I mean, I think it's easy to just lay blame for this war on the Israeli prime minister, who has certainly had Iran in his sights since October 7th and made it very clear that Israel is facing a seven-fronted war and that it intends to go after that so-called head of the octopus, if you will. But I think we can't just assign full blame or responsibility to the Israeli prime minister. He certainly was influential enough to convince Donald Trump to go along with this war. And I think that the agency and the decision does lie with the US commander in chief. What's problematic, though, about this war that was clearly planned from many months ago, not just a reaction to the protests and the brutal crackdown seen in Iran on January 8th and beyond, is that this war was organized and executed based on faulty assumptions. And what do I mean by that? I think this is where the Israelis are culpable, and of course, Donald Trump is guilty for falling for it. Rather than basing analysis on evidence, the Israeli system concluded, I don't know how, but perhaps influenced by activists, that the Islamic Republic was weak. And thereby, this was an opportune time to get the job done and finish what was not completed after the 12-day war. And as the war began on February 28th, President Trump intimated that this war would be a 4 or 5 day war. And since then has clearly expressed his surprise that the war has lasted longer, that Iran's response has been much more fierce. And we know that they have not prepared for a longer term war or tried to plan or mitigate against the uncertainties of a war or the so-called known unknowns Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld spoke about during the 2003 Iraq War. So now today we've seen the costs of this war spread. Markets are reacting. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed, and there are many more risks on the horizon. And this looks like it will be a longer war and one that Donald Trump on his own won't be able to decide when it's over.
Yeah, that's interesting. He's lost control of the agenda in that sense. He can't decide. He can declare a victory, but who's going to believe him? The Gulf states, they're getting a hammering right now, and I wonder, Sanam, how angry they are with Donald Trump and whether they can leverage that anger into helping to bring a halt to the war.
Well, I have to say that the Gulf states are in a real predicament. They strongly lobbied against this war. They were supporting any and all diplomatic off-ramps, the Omanis and the Qataris in particular, but I would say the Emiratis and the Saudis, despite reporting to suggest otherwise, did make it clear that they thought this war would be devastating, not just in terms of outcomes, but for themselves also. And they are bearing the price of this war through Iran's retaliation. They've been targeted, the UAE, almost at higher rates than the Israelis, for example. And this war has cost them reputationally, economically, and of course, while not discussed publicly, certainly brought up deep frustrations with the United States. Donald Trump was their president. They, I think, were hopeful when he said back in May of 2025 that regime change was no longer an American agenda for the Middle East. They felt, quite triumphant in having convinced him to support Ahmed al-Shara and see sanctions removed from the new Syrian government post-fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime. And then here they have been woefully disappointed and let down, actually, in a way, because the United States didn't think about their defense needs in the way that the United States thought about Israel's defense needs. So this has brought up all sorts of frustrations. What does this mean for their role going forward? Well, first of all, very clearly and overtly, the Gulf states are very angry and frustrated by Iran's retaliation. They don't see this as justified, particularly when they made clear to Washington that there were red lines. They say they haven't had their territory used for these strikes, and they find these attacks to be, obvious violations of their sovereignty. So going forward, we cannot imagine a snapback to the status quo ante between Iran and the Gulf. But more broadly, I think the Gulf states recognize quite realistically that they're stuck between an aggressive Israel and a weakening Iran. And the only off-ramp for them, for their visions, for diversification, for their economies, and for their societies more broadly, is some kind of negotiation. It's more, who are you going to be negotiating with on the Iranian side? And can a deal be achieved while the war is ongoing?
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and Sanam Vakil, Director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to subscribe to our reader-supported daily newsletter. Sign up, and you'll receive the first 2 months free. That's arabdigest.org. The thing about Iran was there are credible reports that there was a deal that was about ready to be signed when the Americans and the Israelis began this war. That deal was very much involving the GCC states and Oman in particular. There must be a sense of betrayal as well as anger because they were that close to getting a deal with Iran. And the Americans and the Israelis blew it out of the water. And as you said, the planning for this war has been going on for a long time.
Well, I think there is going to be more and more of this reporting coming out. There was a report today in The Guardian that Jonathan Powell saw the deal that Iran, in its last round in Geneva, had made substantial and very serious compromises, coming as close as they possibly could to the American asks. And what really happened was a misreading of Iranian intentions or a misunderstanding of what Iran was offering by Trump's appointed negotiators, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who aren't seasoned negotiators. They have gut feelings on deals, maybe, but maybe not also the ability to navigate a complex negotiation. And so, President Trump, from my reading, had made it clear that war was imminent regardless of Geneva, not just by the buildup or of that so-called armada in the region, but because so much planning had gone in and he backed himself into a corner with this sort of statement, help is on its way, when he tried to support the Iranian protesters, that, war was inevitable, if you will.
Mm. Now, you mentioned Iran, and you're quite right. The Gulf states are very angry with Iran. But is there leverage that the GCC can bring to bear? Because I look back, you go back to May last year, but there was serious diplomatic efforts going on. The Saudis, the Emiratis, they made their peace pretty much with Iran. We know that the Qataris have good relations with Iran. Is there a way that the Gulf states can, again, parlay their anger, put some pressure on Tehran?
I don't think right now, I mean, I think ideally the Gulf states want this war to end as soon as possible, but they are not going to have the tools or the ability to curate an off-ramp in the way they were managing negotiations prior to this war. They are certainly back channels and perhaps quiet conversations and efforts at bringing the two sides together. But any negotiation is going to be very much taking place under this fog of war while the war continues, because Iran cannot afford to negotiate with President Trump once a ceasefire has been declared. They have the most leverage while the war is going on. And Trump sees that as well from his perspective. I think the Gulf states can pressure, can certainly make it clear to President Trump that they have weeks or a couple of months before this leads to a further crises, and there certainly will be many economically, particularly if the Strait of Hormuz is not opened in a serious way. And they also have, leverage in a post-war situation. But, it's important to remember that for the Gulf, there will be a real reckoning after this war in terms of their security, in terms of their relationship and reliance on the United States, and with regards to their two normalization tracks, one with Iran and with Israel.
Yeah, yeah, and as you say, I mean, those Gulf states, they are going to have issues with food. They're going to have issues with water. It's not just the energy and the oil that's being impeded. There are really serious issues they're facing. But many countries in the Middle East are caught in this war, a war that they didn't want, certainly. But I want to focus, if I can, Sanam, on Iraq, which was just beginning to turn the corner economically, and you could argue even politically. What is this war doing to Iraq? Because there they are sitting right next door to Iran.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, certainly Iraq is in a precarious position, and there have been some strikes on some of these Iran-aligned militias over the past week. Iraq has also had to reduce oil exports, for example, because of the backup in the Strait of Hormuz, and oil, and that will, of course, have a knock-on effect on Iraq's own economy. And it's worthwhile remembering that Iraq held elections just a few months ago. They still don't have a new government in place. So this could actually afford a candidate like Prime Minister Soudani an opportunity to stay in power, maybe as a caretaker, or if he builds support in the system to shepherd Iraq and protect Iraq from what's going on around the region. That is certainly an outcome that perhaps would insulate Iraq, as Soudani was relatively effective at insulating Iraq over the past few years of conflict across the region.
He has, as you said, done that and done that well, particularly when you look back to previous administrations. But of course, you've got those those militias rather, that Iran influences in Iraq, and we've seen that attack on the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. If Sudani returns, do you think he'll be able to do anything about that?
Well, I think what Soudani has been particularly good at doing is trying to assert Iraqi interests and take advantage of maybe the weakening of Iran's regional influence for Iraq's economic and security purposes. And that's sort of a good argument to keep him in place and keep him in post. Obviously, there's still some rogue elements within the system that are worthwhile watching. But, if you look around the region, most of the Iran-backed groups have been degraded. There is a war, a second front having opened between Israel and Hezbollah, and the reality, I think, is that Iraq doesn't want to see a broader conflict with Israel, and so there is an argument for restraint with those militias, and perhaps Soudani can and continue to make and impose that logic of restraint.
Yeah, that's an interesting, and dare I say, an encouraging thought in an otherwise bleak landscape. You know, it sometimes feels to me anyway that the UK and Europe are spectators at a debauch. And I'm just wondering, we've talked about the influence that could be brought to bear by the Gulf states, for example, on Trump. What influence can we and the Europeans have? And is there a danger we could be pulled further and further into an everlasting war, or as Keir Starmer put down his red line and said, no, we're not going in, as have other European leaders.
Well, I think it's quite interesting to watch the European and UK response right now. It looks like this kind of is the enough is enough moment after contending with President Trump and his bullying approach, be it on tariffs, be it on the transatlantic relationship, Russia, Ukraine. There have been a number of shocks to the relationship. I think that most European countries and the UK, I'm quite happy to see, are recognizing that this was a war of choice, a war that was executed without sort of legal justification. There was no case made for this war, and they recognize the real risks. And what they very much worry about is that if they do get dragged in, and right now they're providing sort of defensive support particularly for partners in the region. What they're worried about is at some point, President Trump will get bored or call time on this war, and he will try and negotiate or manage a U.S. exit, and they will be left carrying the bag.
Yeah, yeah, that's the real concern. Um, just finally, Sanam, there is much debate about the extent of support the Iranian regime has inside Iran. And is an assumption made by Trump and others that the Iranian people will rise up. But on your social media, you ask a very good question. Who is providing the analysis for this assumption? So, how do you read the situation in Iran, and how likely is it that the regime will fall anytime soon?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I think this war has been prosecuted with faulty assumptions that the regime was weak, that this would be a quick operation. And I think the third assumption is that the ground will be made fertile for a change in the regime or an Iranian revolution. And unfortunately, I'm of the view that this war began without preparing the terrain or working with Iranians inside and outside to help nurture that outcome, which is almost impossible to nurture anyway. It's still early days. I do think that the Islamic Republic is very cognizant that it has a, broad-based internal security threat. Iranians continue to protest. January, we saw very serious protests across the country, and thousands of people were killed. And that this war hasn't eradicated that threat. But to assume that this system would, quickly collapse and Iranians would be able to work together and marshal a sort of alternative, I think is also naive and not reflective of the reality on the ground. There is an opposition in Iran, but of course it's been repressed, and there is an external opposition, but it's very divided. So we have to see what happens when the war comes to an end and how this war comes to an end. Because if the Islamic Republic gets what it wants out of this war, it will be its survival as well as a guarantee that somehow it won't be struck again. And that will, of course, leave the Iranian people that have been hopeful for a change in governance and waiting for the death of Khamenei to perhaps see that through. It will leave them wholly disappointed and let down.
Mm. Sanam, final question. Is there a way out? Do you see a way out? Because this war is causing enormous damage, certainly to the people in Iran. And I look at what's happening in Lebanon, and of course, the Gulf states are getting hit. It's causing global impact to economies. Uh, is there a way out, Sana?
I have to say, I'm personally I'm struggling to think of what the way out is because obviously the off ramp or the quick off ramp is a deal, but that deal will leave an empowered but wounded system in place, and Donald Trump will have helped breathe life back into a weakening Islamic Republic. And for Iranians, I think that is a devastating outcome. But ultimately, I also think that prolonging the war is not going to deliver the outcomes or positive outcomes for the region more broadly, also for Iranian people. So, I'm caught between my hope and impulse to support change in Iran, but hampered by the reality of the facts on the ground. And so it is hard to see how this is going to end, but I do think it does have to end.
Yeah, 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 it does. It does have to end. Well, okay, we'll leave it there, Sanam, and I thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much, Bill. It was a pleasure.
My guest today was Sanam Vakil, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at London's Chatham House. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. You no doubt have noticed we bring you the podcast with no sponsors and no advertising. It's the same for our daily newsletter. Our support comes only from our subscribers. For more information on subscriptions, if you sign up, we're offering 2 months free. Head to our website, arabdigest.org. Here at the Digest, we are following the Iran war and other developments in the Arab world with analysis and commentary from a team of Middle East experts you will not find anywhere else. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest, essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.